Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Scott Worden, and I'm the director of the Afghanistan and Central Asia program for the U.S. Institute of Peace. I'd like to thank you all, as well as our esteemed panelists, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us for this important discussion about the ongoing and concerning situation in Afghanistan. We invite everyone to take part in today's conversation by asking a question using the chat box function located just below the video player on the USIP event page. We also ask that you please include your name and specify your affiliation or where you're joining us from when you do ask a question. And finally, you can engage with us and each other on Twitter with today's hashtag #AfghanistanUSIP, all one word. As many of you know, USIP was founded by Congress 35 years ago as an independent, national, and nonpartisan institute dedicated to preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. We have been engaged in Afghanistan since 2002, focusing on rule of law, peace building, and inclusive governance, and those tasks have never been more urgent than they are today. It's been nearly 5 months since the Taliban took control of Kabul and the Afghan Republic, the Democratic Republic, collapsed. There's been a reduction in violence since the Taliban's military victory with the end of the insurgency, but the hardship for many Afghans has increased as the economic and humanitarian emergency replaces the insurgency as the biggest threat to the Afghan people. The UN issued yesterday an unprecedented $4.5 billion appeal for humanitarian assistance in 2022 and noted that a majority of Afghans face acute hunger and severe poverty in the coming months. The humanitarian disaster that people have been predicting is now upon us. The causes of the current crisis are complicated, and they include sanctions and the withdrawal of donor funding for a Taliban regime that is unrecognized and includes leaders on terrorist sanctions lists. Beneath that, however, are much broader governance deficiencies the Taliban have, including ethnic exclusion, a total lack of technical capacity, and rollbacks on human and women's rights. The governance gap, its implications, and possible ways to address it are the focus of today's conversation. To engage in that discussion, we have an excellent lineup of experts joining us. After introducing them, I will ask them a few rounds of questions as the moderator, and then invite audience participation. Please, again, place your questions in the chat box on the event page, and we will select from that list. Our first panelist is Rahmatullah Amiri, who is a researcher and analyst with the Liaison Office in Kabul and an independent consultant with deep experience as a researcher focusing on peace, reconciliation, humanitarian access, and social political issues. We're also joined by Palwasha Kakar, who is USIP's acting director for religion and inclusive societies. Palwasha previously worked at the Asia Foundation in Kabul, where she was the Director for Women's Empowerment and Development. Asfandyar Mir recently joined USIP as a senior expert in the Asia Center. Previously, he was a fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. His research interests include international relations of South Asia, US, counterterrorism policy, and political violence, and he focuses on Afghanistan and Pakistan in particular. And finally, Andrew Watkins is a senior expert on Afghanistan with USIP after joining us from the International Crisis Group, in addition to years of experience analyzing security risks for NGOs in Afghanistan. So let me now, without further ado, begin. And Amiri, let me ask you a question about the current situation on the ground. I know you've been in close contact both with Taliban as well as civil society leaders, and you've studied the Taliban for many years. How would you describe the current conditions in Afghanistan? How bad is the humanitarian economic crisis that I mentioned? And is it affecting all parts of Afghanistan equally, would you say?
Thank you, Scott, for having me in this panel with this amazing panelist. Just to start, the situation is pretty bad right now. So the crisis in Afghanistan, this humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, just didn't start with August 15, 2021, with the collapse or fall of the Republic. It was before that, many years before that. The situation in the villages were horrible, but unfortunately, nobody reported. With the collapse in August 15, 2021, 2021, what happened is that a new disaster started, besides the disaster that was already happening in the villages and remote areas. And this disaster hit mainly the urban areas, the major cities, thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that work for the Afghan government, NGOs, and other, they just lost their jobs and their daily income was being hit hard. And so what happened, and then in the meantime, the banking system collapsed, and what happened is that these all crises came together and made a mess in Afghanistan right now. For example, if you go to Eastern Afghanistan, thousands of people were working for NDSF, and now they're jobless. Their families were dependent on those salaries, but they no longer have those salaries coming. And for example, before the fall of the Republic in August 15, 2021, the situation, for example, in Zurmat, some villages that I visited back then, actually some literally told me that they eat grass. They eat just bread. They have nothing else. They borrow flour from the family, but because of the restrictions by the donors back then, that you cannot work in the Taliban control area, or you don't have to pay and also the problems from the Taliban side, because they ask for the tax, and this created a huge things in those areas. And plus, in some areas, Taliban at all didn't allow any aid and donor agencies because they accused them of spying and other things, especially in the southern Afghanistan. So this, what created it was sort of a system that nobody knew that, okay, what's going on in those villages and areas, and completely those signs were ignored. And then when this crisis happened, and combined with those others, it just created a huge humanitarian disaster. And right now, I mean, the banking system, everything that is collapsed, it's making it further and further worse. People don't know what to do. A lot of people are fleeing to Iran and other countries they think that they can, besides security reasons, they think that they can find some sort of jobs and they can send some money. And so right now it's a mess. Scott.
Thanks for that. A difficult situation. Let me ask, in your analytical view, how you think the Taliban are perceiving the situation and their situation as now leaders of the country. I think a lot of people, and including some Taliban, have said that their complete takeover was a surprise, and it happened more quickly than even they expected. So, in some senses, is this a case of be careful what you wish for? Now they're in charge of a government that, as you said, had or a state that had lots of problems before, and then sanctions and other issues compound that. What's their perception or approach to governance now that they are in charge?
I think one of their problems that they still don't own the crisis. That's one of the thing, and it's not just because of them. It's also the international community, the way they're dealing with them. That make them hold accountable for the crisis. They accuse the international community for creating the crisis. Therefore, they have to, find a way to solve this crisis. And this crisis cannot be solved by humanitarian crisis. It's a political crisis. The Taliban are thinking it's not a political crisis. Without solving the political side of this crisis, I don't think the humanitarian side will have a sustainable solution. And Taliban, I mean, the issue with them is that they're very good when it comes to implementations, but the thing is they don't have the means and resources. They don't, for the means and resources, because the international community doesn't want to work with them on any of those things. Yes, behind the doors, they work with them, like, for example, from the UN and others, they work with them in some respects, in some ways, but for how long? And, the question is is not just that, they work with them, but the thing is, how sustainable are those? I mean, if it's not today, if tomorrow they have to come up and step up. The international community will, like the way they did withdraw in August 15, 2021, they will also say, well, this crisis is enough. So I think, that the lack of owning the problem and coming up with solutions that we don't see at this point in time, and that solution is not that, they think that, if you give us the money, we will solve. No, I mean, that's the problem. They have to first come up with the political solutions, because the moment they have a political solutions, they will have, they will find ways how to work with the international communities. When they find a way to work with the international communities, then they will have the resources and collaborations and partnership with the international community, how to, come up with the long-term solutions and ways to deal with this. But right now, just because, they're ready tomorrow to work with the humanitarian crisis, but the international community will not work with them, because that's not, so it's not just a black and white picture, it has so many dimensions, this crisis, Scott.
Yeah, thanks for that. I definitely want to come back to the political side of this, and we have 90 minutes because of the complexity of it. Let me just turn next to Paul Washa, and we talked about the scope of the humanitarian crisis. And I mentioned at the top, there's also I think a rights crisis, a human rights crisis, a women's rights crisis. People have been quite critical of the Taliban's rollback on rights. People are especially fearful of a return to the particularly restrictive and even, I would say, abusive policies of the Taliban in the 90s. And I'm wondering, from what you're hearing, from what you're observing, what is the state of the rights rollback now? How realistic is it for the Taliban to improve on the record of the 90s? Have they moderated at all? And what are you hearing from the ground?
Thank you for that question, Scott. It's a really difficult one to answer. And in fact, what we're hearing from the ground from many of our partners and those that we've worked with is that this seems to be just tactics, that the Taliban, their difference of approach, where they're now allowing girls, say, up to 6th grade in around Afghanistan to go to school, and then in 19 provinces, allowing some of them to go further on, is just a tactic. And there seems to be this push and shove between communities and the Taliban, where the Taliban will implement something and then the communities will protest, and then they'll come back and they'll say, okay, well, now we're going to open it back up, or we're going to do something different. And it's just, people feel like they're just being played with, and that this is something temporary until the Taliban receive enough international attention, enough international aid and recognition. And so there's a lot of women that are worried, and also men that are worried that if this turns into international recognition, the Taliban will just go right back, revert right back to the 1990s. Some of the things that we're seeing, of course, I talked about education. There's some difficulties in healthcare. We heard in Faryab where the Taliban went and spoke to the female doctors and actually told them, you shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z. You need to limit, for example, your treatment of men. You're not allowed to treat men. You're not allowed to prescribe certain drugs. Those kinds of things where limitations were given on them. And then we're seeing in the justice sector where no female lawyers, no female judges are allowed at all. The Independent Bar Association has completely been dismantled and been brought under the Ministry of Justice. So there's all these things. And what we're observing also is that women are not going to courts. They're not being observed in courts. And this is even something worse than the past. In the 90s, women did go to courts where the Taliban were presiding, and now we're not seeing that as well. And they're feeling that they're not safe. So those are a number of areas. The Taliban have intensified their crackdown just in the last week on women. We've seen that protesters in Police Sorkh area of Kabul were actually beaten because of not observing appropriate Islamic hijab. Protesters have been fired upon, and protesters in Kapisa, female protesters in Kapisa were detained, the community calls it abducted, arrested, however you want to put it, but they were put in jail, and there was a huge community outcry, including from religious leaders in the mosques, that then eventually led to their release. But we've heard also unconfirmed reports of protesters in other provinces, female protesters in other provinces being detained and tortured as well. So that's on the women front. On human rights abuses, we're seeing beyond just women, journalists are being targeted. We continue to see those security forces being targeted. Revenge killings are happening. Even we have reports of doctors being killed. And these are kinds of things that in the past, under the Taliban, there was some sort of a security force that prevented some of this happening. And now it seems like with the jails being open and there isn't as much control over criminal activity, that all kinds of things like this are cropping up. And then the final thing I wanted to mention is those that have shown online dissent are also being arrested. We saw the prominent Professor Faisal Jalal being arrested and recently released, and then others who've been arrested that are not as well known, and still it's unknown where they are and when they will be released. So those are some of the things that we're observing right now.
Thanks for that. You mentioned tactics, and I want to touch on another dimension that particularly affects women's rights, but human rights more generally. And the Taliban often have tried to say encouraging things, at least to Western audiences, about respecting rights, but there's often added the caveat in accordance with Islam. Now, of course, Islam is a broad religion, and it's practiced by many in different ways. But I'm wondering, what's your take on that caveat? What do the Taliban really mean by that? Is there any clarity about how they will interpret Islam? Is this just a way of covering what will really be restrictive rights, or are they open to debate or dialogue on religious grounds about how they should treat social policy in Afghanistan?
Scott, I think that that's a really important point, because what we're noticing is when they talk about according to Islam or even according to Hanafi jurisprudence, there's this very big discrepancies in how they interpret that and what is in Hanafi jurisprudence, particularly related to women's rights. For example, in Hanafi jurisprudence, there is nothing about women covering their faces. Arwa is not, the face and the hands are not included as places that should be covered according to Hanafi jurisprudence. For example, in Hanafi jurisprudence, women can be judges. So there's all of these things that are, and then, for example, in Hanafi jurisprudence, there's a very big emphasis on bay'ah, or pledging of allegiance to the head of state, and a head of state being basically elected by the people, by the public. And we have the example of Imam Abu Hanifa himself refusing to pledge allegiance to the Abbasid ruler Mahdi, saying, you haven't been approved by the people, they haven't pledged you allegiance, and you need the public to pledge you allegiance. So these are some of the things that are in Hanafi jurisprudence, specifically Hanafi jurisprudence, that the Taliban claim to follow, and they're not following those things. So it does seem to be very much tactics, very much politics. However, we are seeing some breakthrough moments where, for example, in Herat, the ulama were able to overturn the Taliban's ruling of closing the women's hammams. And they were saying the women's bathhouses, the Taliban were saying they needed to be closed. And the ulama there in Herat said, no, this goes against Islamic jurisprudence. Women should have a place to be able to wash and clean and make their ablutions and be ready for prayer. And through their fatwas, they were able to overturn that and reopen the hammams. Similarly, with the Kapisa abduction of the women, we saw the outcry from the mosques. The ulama stood up for those women and asked for them to be released. So we're seeing some of these breakthrough moments where the ulama are standing up and there's making some changes. But overall, we're not seeing this. We heard the ulama in Doha speak against the Taliban's decision on education, on girls' education. It didn't seem to make a dent really in what they're doing. We still haven't seen girls' schools above 6th grade open at a large scale in Afghanistan, things like that. So it's a lot of politics, and we're still waiting to see really how that's going to happen. But at this point, it doesn't seem very likely that the religious argument is going to do much without some sort of political backing or some sort of political gain that the Taliban will see out of it.
Thanks for that. Again, the politics. So we'll definitely flag that as our conversation goes on. Let me turn to Asfandyar. and talk about a third significant interest, maybe even the most significant U.S. national security interest, which is the terrorism threat that Afghanistan poses. Of course, the Taliban committed in the U.S. Taliban agreement to prevent al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups, likely ISIS, from launching attacks from Afghan soil. What's your assessment of, one, the sincerity of that commitment toward the U.S. and to other allies since the Taliban victory? Are they still bound by that? Are they still intending to not allow al-Qaeda or other groups to operate? But also, what's their ability to, if they are sincere, what's their ability to deliver on counterterrorism commitments, considering the humanitarian crisis and the unrest that persists in the country?
Sure. Thanks so much for this opportunity, Scott, to join this very distinguished group on this really important and sobering topic. I'm delighted to be here, but also as concerned about the continuing distress that the Afghan people face in Afghanistan. The Taliban has been slowly walking back or strongly caveating many of their key declarations and commitments on various issues that they've made over the last few years. I think Palasha documented or spoke about some of them. And my assessment is that terrorism and counterterrorism as an issue area is no different. I don't see real sincerity or commitment on part of the Taliban to work with the international community to meaningfully stem the terror threat from Afghanistan, in Afghanistan for now. And the Taliban retains strong relationships with various terror groups in the country, despite their commitments as part of the Feb 2020 US Taliban agreement. What is most concerning is that they are providing what amounts to de facto political asylum to a lot of groups and their people in the country. And they've also ensured that key leaders of many of these groups have freedom of movement, the kind of movement, freedom of movement that they did not enjoy prior to August 15, 2021. Groups that are benefiting from the Taliban's support include, in my assessment, al-Qaeda and its local units in Afghanistan. My sense is that al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri remains alive, and he may well be in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. Could be in Pakistan as well, but I think a reasonable likelihood that he is in Afghanistan. With a lot of al-Qaeda allies now in key positions in the Taliban's government, my assessment is that the Iran-based al-Qaeda leadership is better positioned than before to relocate to the country if it wants to. And then perhaps one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Taliban's largesse is the group, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, or Pakistan Taliban, as it is generally known. The leadership of this group has stepped up its campaign of violence in Pakistan from bases in Afghanistan. In November, there was some glimmer of hope that perhaps the Taliban are going to get serious about the TTP, but restraining the TTP. They brokered a ceasefire between Pakistan and the TTP, but that ceasefire lapsed. And now the Taliban remain non-committal on the future of TTP in Afghanistan. There are various Central Asian jihadis which have relocated within Afghanistan and continue to steadily build up. Their size is most certainly growing. I think there are efforts to further unify some of these Central Asian jihadis to boost their campaigns in Central Asian republics. Then there are anti-India jihadis, anti-China jihadis, such as those of the Turkestan Islamic Party. So that, that's the ecosystem that the Taliban are aligned with. On the other hand, I think it's clear more than ever that the Taliban see ISIS in Afghanistan to be one of the most important, significant threats they face, perhaps even more significant than the threat due to the humanitarian disaster unfolding in the country. They are fighting ISIS, no doubt about it. They're seeking to target the group, especially in the east of the country. There's been a major crackdown undertaken by the Taliban, especially in Nangarhar. But here is where we're at on that crackdown. You asked about capacity. The Taliban's counterinsurgency is relatively indiscriminate. They are repressing lots of Salafi communities in the east of the country because they see them as associated with providing for ISIS in Afghanistan. And they're also rounding up minorities, political opponents, other vulnerable groups, casting them as ISIS affiliates members as well, which I think is counterproductive. So as a result, perhaps there are serious reports of ISIS-K activity in various parts of the country, which previously indicated no meaningful ISIS activity. And to top it off, and I think this is where the international community kind of comes in, Taliban have not been able to detain or neutralize any senior leader of ISIS-K until now. ISIS leaders Shahab al-Muhajir, Aslam Faruqi, they remain at large, and Taliban have not been able to get them. The question is capacity the reason the Taliban are not going against some of these major terror groups that they're aligned with? I think it can be, to be fair to the Taliban, but they have to actually make that determination that they want to do something about these groups. But for now, that is not the fundamental reason for Taliban's support or continuing assistance for all of these groups. I think reasons of ideology, ideological commitment to the brothers of in jihad who subordinate themselves to the Taliban. I think those reasons are more important to the Taliban's calculus than considerations of capacity.
Thanks. Your description of the different regional actors that are coming into Afghanistan raises another question, which is when you look at the terrorism threat that might emanate from Afghanistan, is it greater, would you say, for the U.S. and our close allies, or greater for the region? And ultimately, are those interests aligned between, let's say, the U.S. and NATO, as well as diverse actors like Iran, China, and Central Asia and Pakistan?
Sure. My sense is that the more near-term threat is to Afghanistan's neighbors and other regional powers, which is going up substantially. Pakistan certainly faces a more emboldened and higher capacity threat in the shape of the Pakistan Taliban, which Pakistani policymakers have been understating for a while and are only starting to consider seriously now, it appears. Central Asian governments are watching the movement of groups like Islamic Jihad, Katibat Imam al-Bukhari, Jamaat Ansarullah with a lot of nervousness. And I think some of these governments are starting to voice that nervousness, such as the government of Tajikistan recently. And then China, which initially looked like it would move in sort of quickly to recognize the Taliban, appears not so convinced of the Taliban sort of talk on terrorism. And it's not hearing what it wants to hear, seeing what it wants to see. And that's because my sense is Chinese assess that the Taliban are not in the mood to move against some of the threats that they are concerned about, like Turkestan Islamic Party. Which is why I think China's aid to Afghanistan is around the same amount as what Al-Qaeda and bin Laden were giving to Mullah Omar before 9/11. To be sure, the threat to the US and NATO allies is there, and it's not very far off from the threat that a lot of these regional countries are facing. I think it's building up. ISIS-K is certainly committed to a major attack against the US homeland, and Al-Qaeda, I would note, through its branch in Yemen, in some of the same messaging streams in which it praises and applauds the Taliban, has again threatened major attacks against the US in near term. So I think the threat against the US and its NATO allies very much remains.
Thanks for that. Andrew Watkins, you've been patient. Let me get to you and start to talk a little bit about politics, but in the context of the question, how stable is the Taliban's hold on power here? On the one hand, their military victory was quite complete, and they quelled the small armed opposition that emerged in Panjshir. On the other hand, the Taliban, one of the surprises of this situation, I think, is that the Taliban were manifestly unpopular throughout their insurgency, never really showing any mass appeal. So you have an unpopular regime with firm military control for now, and all these problems that we've just talked about over the last half hour. I mean, what's your assessment of the stability of the Taliban government right now?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And no problem being patient with a panel like this. It's been great to hear everyone's inputs and thoughts. When we think about the stability of the Taliban as a government or as a ruling regime, to me, the most important starting point is comparing how we might measure the fragility of a state versus how the Taliban themselves might measure either their strength or their effectiveness or their own fragility. What I want to do is ask not how do we think the Taliban look as we think states should look, but what is the Taliban's conception of what a good job would be for themselves? And I think there's a really stark divide, and it touches on everything that our other speakers have spoken about. This is a group that is still mired in a militant movement's modus operandi across the board when it comes to how it responds to the humanitarian crisis, when it comes to the idea of the threat of terrorism or other security challenges, also when it comes to human rights and even the core idea of service delivery. This is a group that seems to believe its job is not to serve its population, its people, but to protect them. And that's being very generous. That's giving a bit of a benefit of the doubt to the Taliban and assuming benevolent intent. But we have a group that perceives everything that it does as protection over the Afghan people, with a very Hobbesian take on how the world works and all of the dangers and threats that are out there. That just so happens to correspond with what this group has done best over the last 20 years, which is to identify and hunt down and then attack or extinguish threats. At the time, for the last 2 decades, that threat was a government that they believed to be illegitimate. Today, the threats are manifold, right? And there's so many things that they just don't have the capacity or the resources to do, as Amiri noted. But if you ask the Taliban whether they've done what they really want to do, I think they might say yes. Their sources of instability over the longer term is a really interesting question, because right now what they've demonstrated in one decision after another is that they're perfectly fine with running a government that effectively just elevates their movement, their insurgent movement, their jihadist movement into the halls of power, but transforming into a political actor, transforming into what we think of as a more conventional state and all of the organs that a state requires and nurtures. They don't even seem to have bought into that core concept of what we might think of as a modern state. So in that sense, it's incredibly fragile, and there's a lot down the road that might really trouble them. But if they're fine with running a proto-state, if they're fine with running a national scale version of their militant movement that supplies only the most basic services, most of which would be their ideas of law and order, or security, then in that sense, they might be able to do that for quite some time.
So Afghanistan is the graveyard of many things, people say, among them is predictions. But I want to challenge you and go to the other panelists as well to try to project, as you've started down this path, how you see things unfolding over the next year. I think most people presume this humanitarian crisis will actually, unfortunately, get worse before it gets better. That will presumably generate a certain amount of social pressure on the Taliban, who, as we said, has sole control. And we talked about political pressures, of course, and further, I'll prompt you for some analysis that say there are internal divisions within the Taliban that are unfolding between different factions. But if you look at this as I'm thinking a pressure cooker, where is the pressure release? Is it toward reform? Along the lines that at least internationals and their sanctions would hope for? Is it toward a crackdown? Is it towards splintering? How do you see pressure being managed in this system under the current circumstances? And I'll get your views first, but I want other views on that as well.
Sure. Unfortunately, I think the most likely outcome, broadly speaking, is crackdowns. And again, that's across the board. And I think in response to a variety of perceived threats, that's what this group has honed and refined itself as a war-fighting machine for years now, down to the individual level of the young men who've been trained and indoctrinated, brainwashed in some ways, brought up in a system that is intended to teach them and to school them in doing one thing, which is, overthrowing the previous regime. Those skills and those mindsets and that mentality is geared towards cracking down on what they see as problems or threats or dissent, as we've seen, even peaceful dissent through speech. The idea that this movement could move towards reform would require changing at the individual level, at the level of every rural pocket where the Taliban has drawn its people from, the grievances that they've come to, the worldviews that they embrace would require changing away from an idea that what we are is a movement that enforces law and order and security through either violence or the coercive threat of violence. And it would need to transform into a very different idea of what it means to be in power and what it means to, watch over and to rule a country's population. That kind of transformation, I don't see evidence, although the Taliban is a closed and opaque movement, I don't see evidence of that vast and wide-ranging intellectual transformation taking place, certainly not in the near term. But when you characterized it as a sort of pressure cooker situation, the severity of what's going on in Afghanistan, I would maybe suggest that although the pressure is building and this is going to be one of the world's worst crises with devastating impact, it might not take that much of a release valve to release the pressure. What I mean is, look at, for instance, just yesterday's news that the Taliban plan to implement a wide-ranging wheat for work program, either being unable or unwilling to dip into their own cash reserves to pay civil servants' salaries. They're going to start doling out rations of wheat and wheat flour to hundreds of thousands of Afghans in lieu of a monetary salary. Now, that sounds outrageous, and that could be perceived from our outside view as a serious weakness of the government. But what if things are already getting so bad, have gotten so bad inside the country, that that's actually quite a relief to many of these families, and that might be just enough pressure relieved from absolute disaster that we don't see things bubble up quite the way we might anticipate, or at least not in the near term. Thanks.
Thanks. Let me get other views. Amiri, so essentially the same question to you. I mean, amid growing pressure, do you see Taliban hardening, softening, or cracking?
So to answer that, I need to give a little bit more context. I mean, Taliban is kind of entity that, they believe in some stuff. Like one of the stuff is that 20 years, the international community, did a lot of harm to our communities, and that's why the community hate us. Therefore, the community now needs kind of, our engagement from the Bison Virtue and others, from religious scholars, to bring them back to. So basically they're saying that they're not against us because, we're bad, because they say they're against us because, they're influenced by the international community, just to put it in a simple way. So basically their plan is, the way they want support in rural communities, they literally plant one religious person in each family. So they're kind of thinking that if people become more religious and more, so that's where they can see more people on their side. Once people are on their side, if it's worse or bad, they will support them in any situations, the way the rural communities did in the rural areas. People were in a horrible situation but did not complain because of Taliban. So they just think that, yeah, that's the way. So they're kind of working on the soft power to kind of have community, but that's actually a miscalculation. I mean, there's like 39 million, I mean, 35 million, 39 million. I mean, we don't know the exact number of people are living there. I mean, governance is not going to be just the way it was in 1990s, or so Taliban are actually miscalculating. But Taliban also has their own problem. For example, the internal structure, makes it very difficult for them to make any reforms. The narrative that comes from military commanders, from middle level commanders, from local commanders, that actually shape their policies, their policies and way forward. And at the same time, lack of leadership. I mean, the thing is, the Taliban process is consultative process, whatever comes, they have to talk to each other, and nobody wants to bring a sensitive issue, for example, inclusion in these things among the topics, because then he will be seen some sort of like, yeah, why are you advocating for such thing? It's too early. And the other thing is religious scholars, that shape sort of their policies, governance, and everything. That's why they called recently for a religious shura, because that will take a lot of pressure from the political actors if the religious scholar decides. Look, religious scholars, play a very important role in their legitimacy. Their source of legitimacy is driven by the religious. No matter the whole country says anything, if the religious scholars support it, that's it. That's what that's what matters to them the most. So that's why when they try to engage, to kind of have the religious scholars view on some of these points, some of these reforms, some of, like, for example, women's inclusivity and other things. Once they have that, then that will kind of. But still, on one hand, they're kind of bounded by and influenced by the religious scholars. On the other hand, they're kind of influenced by the military guys, and then they're also the process consultative. So that makes it the whole, Taliban dealing with the local issues, or with the Afghanistan issue, national level, very complicated. And it makes it more and more, for them to delay it further and give a very, very standard answers. Now that's one part. On the other part is the international community, the external factors when it comes to the Taliban policies. There's a very lack of consistency in engagement from the peace talks to right now, even at this point in time. There's no consistency. What needs to be done? Taliban are thinking that it's a matter of time before everybody recognizes them. I mean, this needs to be clearly communicated. Millions of people are living day to day, we're hoping that something, that tomorrow news will come, and this, the lack of international community, clear response to engagement. Yes, they did come up with some statements, but those statements are still not very clear. Sometimes they say one thing, then the second time they announce a couple $1 million, and they talk about the Afghan people, but there's no who are the Afghan peoples, how are they going to engage, so those actually sending a very mixed signals to the communities and also to the Taliban, to everyone, that nothing is decided, anything can go anyways, and this makes Taliban think that they have a little bit the upper hand. Scott.
Thanks, very interesting. So Palwasha, just get you in on this discussion as well. Your reactions on how pressure will impact the Taliban and the governance situation. But I wonder also if you have thoughts on my thesis to begin with. How much pressure do you think will come from within Afghanistan? I think the U.S. audience, the Western audience, hears overwhelmingly from those leaders of civil society, many of whom left, but who are oriented more toward Western donors, Western donor programs. Of course, civil society is much broader than that. And Amiri mentioned religious leaders having great influence. There's the grassroots that isn't heard from. Is there going to be significant pressure from within Afghan society, or are they in a position of weakness where there won't be that much pressure on the Taliban to reform or improve?
I think, Scott, that's a really good point. I think there is pressure internally, and we're seeing that by the protests that are happening when something happens that they disagree with. The ulama have stood up. I just wanted to clarify, I think, that what Amiri was mentioning in terms of the Taliban really listening to the religious scholars is they listen to their own religious scholars within their own movement. And so we need to make a distinction between the ulama, or the religious scholars within the Taliban movement that they listen to, and then the non-Taliban religious scholars here, who have, like I said, in some instances been able to have to use their leverage and knowledge of Islam to make difference, but in general doesn't seem to have a huge impact overall. I don't feel like the internal pressure from the Afghan population, we've seen them demonstrating, we've seen the outcry, we've seen people dying, we've seen IDPs being beaten when they're trying to go back to their land, all kinds of things are happening. It doesn't really seem to make a huge difference. Some of the protests in some of the big cities seem to have some small effects on certain issues, but we're not seeing that large effect overall. What does seem to make an impact is the international community and the role the international community is playing. Unfortunately, when the Taliban decide that they're going to focus on beheading girl mannequins, the media seems to follow that and be all, up at arms that they're doing this rather than focusing on the starvation that women and children are facing in Afghanistan. And so the Taliban's also lack of attention to the starvation this winter will bring. I mean, there's a estimation that 1 million children will possibly die of starvation in Afghanistan this winter if nothing is done. 22.8 million Afghans are facing starvation right now in this winter. It's very, very severe. And the fact that there is, instead of focusing on how do we overcome this starvation, how do we, give jobs to people, how do we pay the teachers instead of preventing the teachers from going to school to work, how do we pay women, how do we give them jobs, how do we make sure that people have an income, that doesn't seem to be the focus, rather than these petty issues seem to be coming up. And that's really unfortunate in terms of what we're seeing play out with the Taliban. And it does seem that the international community's attention to starvation is really important here, and trying to bring some sort of relief to this. But what I do want to mention is that just bringing wheat into the situation, or rice or flour or oil, isn't really going to solve the problem. We've seen in the past where those kinds of things have been brought in, they spend $150 on rations, and then the family actually needs the money for something else and goes and sells that for $30 and uses it for something else. It's really a huge loss. The importance is purchasing power, and how do we increase purchasing power in Afghanistan? There's a number of different ways to do that, to be able to get money into the hands of Afghans. I think that's really the key issue the international community needs to work on and pay attention to stave starvation in Afghanistan at this point.
Thanks for that. And I appreciate a good segue, because I want to move to a third round of questions, and there is an arc to this, which is the current. We've heard about the current situation. We've had projections about the future, and then I want to ask initially the what to do about it question. And I'm also going to turn to the audience after this. So if you haven't put your questions in the chat, please do so, and we'll select from there. Let me go to you, Esfandiar, and get your kind of regional perspective on how to address what you said before is a significant regional problem. We talked about terrorism, but certainly the collapsed economy of Afghanistan hurts regional trade. The more, nobody's mentioned refugees, but the more economic and hardship and hunger there is, presumably the pressure for refugees to go over into neighboring countries increases. With these risks facing the region, what do you see as their incentives for action? Are they more likely to just close the borders and harden the situation? Will they help the Taliban? How do you think the region can or will act to alleviate at least their own security risks?
Sure. Yeah. Look, I think the region has a lot of tolerance for dysfunction in Afghanistan. really unfortunately, which goes generally underappreciated. I think over the last few years, we've had this this analytical consensus, at least here in the West, that the region is the worst affected, and the region, really wants to prevent the worst case outcome in Afghanistan. But while the region, continuously chastises the United States government for its missteps, and I think many a time they make good points about that, we have not seen the region exert the kind of pressure on the Taliban that is necessary to move them on governance, on issues of political inclusion, terrorism, counterterrorism, and human rights concerns. So, I think you could argue that the region is withholding diplomatic recognition. So in a way, the region is punishing the Taliban, but I'd contend that the region is only withholding de jure recognition. De facto, Taliban stands recognized. Much of the region is engaging with the Taliban, in multiple different ways. Why is the region not pushing the Taliban harder? I think it's because the region has other interests in Afghanistan, which it prioritizes over the sources of potential spillovers due to the humanitarian disaster or the economic crisis. So, China, Russia, Iran, they wanted to see the US out, and their priority was to sort of see the US out, and I think going forward it remains to not allow the US to again have major political influence in Afghanistan. China in particular doesn't seem to mind further erosion of Afghanistan's economy, which is somewhat puzzling to me. For Pakistan, no surprise that it has always been about keeping India out. And even amid all its growing challenges with the Taliban, Pakistan is kind of content with the fact that at least the Taliban are not close to India, like the former Afghan government. So, my depressing sort of conclusion here is that the region will not act, at least in time, or force the hand of the Taliban to fix things. But in the off chance that the region becomes really very concerned that the Taliban are this fundamental obstacle, that they are the source of the current crisis, and if Afghanistan has to be fixed, the Taliban have to be fixed, I think we might see attempts at manipulation of the Taliban's internal politics to influence the group for more favorable governance policies. I think Pakistan could take a lead. Pakistan and China could coordinate. We're already seeing Iran trying to do more, trying to bring in the political opposition. The question is, will they succeed? Will the region succeed? Very hard to say at this time.
Andrew Watkins, what do you see as opportunities for the U.S., for other international actors to positively influence the situation? What are the levers that will work? What should be pulled first?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Just a quick thought following up from Asfandyar's points, which I agree with. I think he's absolutely correct in the broad picture. But in terms of points of leverage, I think it's been interesting to see, even in the past week, some of the regional powers and neighbors, although, as Asfandyar notes, their tolerance for what we might consider unacceptable Taliban behaviors is much greater, and that goes back to a completely different set of national interests and priorities that many of the neighbors have. They're also able to exercise leverage in a way that I think perhaps only neighbors and regional states can, because of the very real tangible payoffs and quid pro quos and benefits that they might be able to offer. The meeting that Iran seemed to put together and perhaps probably insisted on between the Taliban's former foreign minister and several key opposition leaders in Tehran this past week. On one level, that could have been largely symbolic. That may be dismissed as a photo opportunity for PR purposes. We've yet to see if that will turn into something more real, more substantive. But it does appear to be an instance of successful leverage of Iran, which the Taliban very intently needs technical working level engagement on a number of issues, not just trade, but even water rights and water usage between the two states, et cetera, a number of issues. Iran successfully leveraging what the Taliban needs from them in very real terms to at least inch towards something that we've all been speaking about in very vague, abstract terms, a more inclusive system or inclusion of other political figures and voices. So that's an interesting point. Maybe what I say on the US and various European and other donor states is that it's not as clear if the US or other European countries have that leverage. And I think the belief that the massive amounts of aid and even development assistance that the US, the EU, its member states, et cetera, are able to bring to bear, I think there's long been a hope that that can prove to be a source of leverage, but you only need to look at the track record of the past 20 years. It's incredibly difficult for states that are disengaged and are fairly distant geographically and in many other ways to exert that leverage of donor support unless they truly are willing to back off. In the Taliban's case, the issue is not the one that we had with the previous regime, where we have committed all of this aid and now feel like we can't really credibly threaten to take it all away, as it was with the Islamic Republic. But today, it might not even be credible, the idea that we would give them as much aid as the Republic saw. And so if we think that the promise of future money and funding and engagement and benefits could tempt the Taliban into moderating, are we really serious if we make that promise, that hypothetical promise? Thanks.
Thanks, Balasha. You mentioned you were on the path towards some concrete recommendations, I think, with increasing purchasing power. You referenced earlier the Taliban's strong desire for international recognition. Maybe that amounts to leverage. Just want to invite you to continue on what would be your top actions and opportunities for the US or other international actors to positively influence the situation.
Thank you. Yeah, as I was mentioning, I think it's really important to think of the Afghan people and giving purchasing power to the Afghan people and supporting the Afghan people through this crisis, rather than thinking about the Taliban government per se. And I think that finding ways to support the people through this crisis is really important, and not giving international recognition to the Taliban is really important. I think those are two things that we have to figure out how to square the circle, because in terms of supporting the people, how do we do that without giving recognition to the government? It's a big question. Even though it's very clear that there's a specific list of 139 people on the sanctions list in Afghanistan, still banks are risk averse, and we're still having trouble getting money to Afghanistan. It's just not going to happen. So whether there are ways to make it very clear or to help that process, that's something that I hope could be investigated, and some resolution could be found to help the Afghan people particularly avert this crisis and find some way out. In terms of leverage with the Taliban, the way Andrew ended his point about whether it will make any difference, I think that's something, we need to pause and think about. Will giving some sort of sanctions relief on a specific issue or conditions-based issue really tempt the Taliban to change? We haven't really seen any sort of concrete move towards that. We do have the Doha Agreement with the US that the Taliban signed that they have not held on their part. Unfortunately, there's so many pieces to that we can go into, and I think Asfandyar did as well a little bit, that could be points where we could say, well, hey, you didn't uphold this part of your bargain, and if you do uphold, then there may be some ways that we can work, but I don't see any of that happening and making a difference. The only one thing that I think in terms of international pressure is looking to religious scholars, to ulama, particularly those that are borderline on the jihadi side, that may have influence on the Taliban's movement, that are connected to political powers that the Taliban care about, that might have some way of leveraging on particular issues inside of Afghanistan that might help the situation. That's something that could possibly be an area to explore. But again, I really think the international efforts should be to help the Afghan people really work on ending starvation in Afghanistan and finding ways to get help on the ground to the people and not recognizing the Taliban government at this point. Thank you.
Thanks. And just before going to audience questions, Amiri, what's the biggest point of leverage and what should it be used for?
Just to add, I mean, on just one point on the ulama or religious scholars, a lot of them, Taliban are quite popular in a lot of religious scholars. That's one point. And second is that, look, the traditional boxes are not going to work. That's one thing we have seen. That's not going to work. There has to be a new way out. If we just stick to the old traditional boxes and think that a different result, I think it's just a waste of the people of Afghanistan, people who's been suffering for the last 40 years. So here, we've been thinking and working with a lot of people on the ground. One of the way that we see, let's talk a little bit more practical than just, I believe, shooting in the air, is that engagement with the locals. One of the things that Taliban are really afraid of, engagement with the locals, more engagement. Civil society is not, is there. They're active. People are active. People want to participate in politics. People want to challenge Taliban on their decision. I think the international community should work with them, meeting them. Every time, for example, I see these, envoys go to Kabul, they don't meet those local Afghans. I think it's time to work with those locals. If one wants to challenge the Taliban in the future, they have to have, they need to work with the local population. One of the ideas is to kind of even form a sort of like a local representations, engage them every time, for example, a special envoy goes there and meet with these guys. Yes, it takes a lot of risk, but without risk, you will not be able to achieve anything. There's a risk. So those traditional boxes, coming back to the traditional boxes, are not going to work. Working with the locals,